He will give an unreserved apology and say that initially his government was far too complacent and vastly underestimated the risks posed by the virus. That extends to him as well personally.
That a big story has just broken on the Times. The headline is Johnson, I was too complacent about COVID before lockdown. It's broken by Chris Smith, Steve Swinford, our political editor, and Oliver Wright, our policy editor. Chris Smith is our Whitehall editor. The former Prime Minister will apologise for deaths but defend his government's action.
The first is there is something of an apology, not an insignificant apology. He will give an unreserved apology and say that initially his government was far too complacent and vastly underestimated the risks posed by the virus. That extends to him as well personally. He said he's like expected to say that he had a basic confidence that things would turn out to be all right, that they'd turn out to be okay. Clearly, they did not. And he is going to say that unquestionably mistakes were made. But at the same time, he's also going to argue that, look, I think we got the big decisions right, and we ultimately saved hundreds of thousands of lives in doing so.
That's right. And one of the big things is, which came out of the Matt Hancock evidence this week, is with hindsight, they should have locked down 3 weeks earlier than they did. What is Johnson going to say about that?
He says that I locked down at the right time, and he says he highlights new advice which we didn't know about before from Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, who was raising concerns about what was called behavioural fatigue in the run-up to the first lockdown. And he was saying if we went too soon, there was a risk that people would just become completely disenchanted. And so he says that on the timing of it, he thinks he got it right. Now, there are lots of people that are disagreeing with that publicly. Matt Hancock, the health secretary we saw this week, several others have said that he should have gone sooner, but he thinks he got that about right.
But one of the things I think he may apologise for is the fact that in a sort of Boris Johnson-esque way and a sort of carry-on spirit, he was quite visible in ignoring the kind of precautions that people were already taking before the lockdown.
So yeah, one of those was he shook hands with people, and he says that was a mistake, and that he suggests that he should not have been shaking hands with people, which is kind of obvious in hindsight. But there you go. And there's kind of like the main point he makes is that he thought, and others thought, that this was going to be a virus like something like SARS or BSE or other kind of big health threats that had happened, and they hadn't materialised into anything. And that's what where he thinks he got it wrong.
That's right. He said, I had a basic confidence things would turn out all right on the fallacious inductive logic. And if you were wondering how accurate this leak is of Boris Johnson's evidence, I think that phrase, fallacious inductive logic, gives it away, that we'd had Asian zoonotic scares before and they had turned out all right. And so to a certain extent, there was this feeling, this COVID thing, it's a bit like that Asian bird flu thing. It's a storm in a teacup. But the difference here, surely, is that we already knew in January and February that people were dying from COVID and dying in quite significant numbers. I wonder whether he's going to be able to get that past the inquiry.
So what we've got is what Boris is going to tell the inquiry, so what Boris Johnson's expected to say. But what he can't control is the questions that he's going to be asked. There is a pretty aggressive KC that is doing the questioning for the inquiry. And one of the biggest questions is, where were you at the beginning of all of this? There were 5 successive Cobra meetings about COVID that Boris was not at. Dominic Cummings has claimed that that's because he was writing a book about Shakespeare at the time and was distracted by other things. So there are very serious questions for Boris Johnson about what he was doing before the pandemic kind of kicked into force. So you've got his version of events, which we're going to hear, but it's the forensic questioning that will be more difficult for him next week.
And there's something slightly contradictory in the evidence that we have, in the sense that he says on the one hand that he doesn't share the kind of hindsight view that he should have locked down earlier, but at the same time he says if we had properly understood how fast COVID was spreading, the fact that it was spreading asymptomatically, and that's a key, those are my words, that's a key, there are many things we would have done differently. Does he elaborate in the evidence you've seen on what he thinks they should have done differently?
He's slightly vague around what they should have done differently. I mean, clearly he is doing two things at once here. He is acknowledging that some mistakes were made and they didn't treat it seriously enough. But at the same time, he's also saying we got it right. And there is a clear tension between those two things.
The other thing is, I mean, going back to his apology, and he will obviously, that will be, when he issues that apology, that will be one of the clips, I think, that will be played again and again in the hours and days that follows his evidence. But he does also have a phrase about the responsibility he felt as COVID took hold and as things got very serious. So he says, I felt a crushing sense of obligation towards the British public. The use of the word crushing, I think, is very interesting there, and a deep anxiety about how much I was asking them to sacrifice. And there are kind of two things that spring out to me reading that. The first is, this is serious. This is serious, Boris, saying, I took this job very seriously indeed. I felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. But there is also that hint, which has come across in a lot of the evidence so far, where Boris was balancing, and a lot of people sympathise with this, by the way, the need to lock down and control the virus against the massive impact on us, on the public, and on schools, on education, on the economy.
Yes, and that was one of the key things that came out. And one of the interesting things that he will address, we think, in this statement on Wednesday is the question of some of the language that he used around COVID. So he was reported to have said, or Dominic Cummings claimed he said, let the bodies pile high. Another of the claims is that he once said, let it rip. And obviously you've had several people at the inquiry suggest that he thought that older people should get the virus and that the sacrifice would be worth it because younger people would effectively therefore not get COVID. Now, he denies saying these things, but one of the things that is consistent about from our reporting on Boris Johnson is he did like to have kind of polarised arguments, make both of the arguments himself. There was a story about Boris Johnson from when he was at university that he once wowed everyone in the debating society by doing one side of the debate, crossing the floor and doing the other. And that's something that you see repeatedly throughout his time in government. He takes extreme positions. So one of the big questions about that we're going to hopefully get answers to next week is what did he actually say and how does he respond to those questions about his language?
That's not covered in the statement that you've seen.
Well, he does address it. He denies saying it, but there is a lot more evidence now that we have from Patrick Vallance's diaries and elsewhere about the kind of language he is said to have used. There's going to be questions about that.
The really important thing as well in this evidence that people want to hear about is, of course, about Partygate, which contributed to Boris Johnson's downfall. He talks about the issue in terms of his awareness at the time. I was not aware that media reports of lockdown breaches by advisors, officials or ministers had any material impact on observance of the rules or guidance at the time. So his point there is the point I think he made as Partygate broke, that although people were gathered together, they were still observing effectively the rules to all practical purposes.
Yes, and that is something that he's argued. In fact, you'll find very little reference in his statement and when he appears on Wednesday to Partygate at all. Obviously, it dominated the public and dominated media reporting at the time, but he barely touches on it just to claim that it didn't undermine public confidence. You'll also find very little reference to Dominic Cummings. So Dominic Cummings is obviously pivotal in bringing down Boris Johnson, highly critical of him, calling him the trolley and all those kind of things. And it looks to me like Boris Johnson is going to take a deliberate approach of focusing on the kind of policies and the decisions around those rather than the personalities. But the fact is that this COVID inquiry so far has been dominated by the personalities and has been dominated by a series of people saying very rude things about Boris Johnson and his leadership style. He's been accused of facilitating. He's been accused of presiding over a misogynistic number 10. He's been accused of presiding over infighting and chaos, basically. None of those things feature heavily.
And very, very quickly, because one person who's people have been quite rude about has been Matt Hancock, who said rather plaintively today in his evidence he was unaware what the Prime Minister really thought about him. But Boris Johnson does say what he thinks about Matt Hancock in his evidence.
He's very kind to Matt Hancock, we think. He's going to suggest that he did a good job. And in difficult circumstances. But that is different from some of the things that Boris Johnson was saying privately about Matt Hancock in WhatsApp exchanges with Dominic Cummings and others. So there's clearly, hindsight is a wonderful thing, and it's some distance from events at the time, I guess.